I'm going to shift us back into a kind of historical overview of thinking about escape and the city, looking particularly at notions of escape to the city, and then considering ways in which once folks had escaped to the city, they still had to construct various territories and geographies of escape. And I'm going to do that particularly by focusing on what we could generically call queer space in the city, looking at the ways that gays and lesbians began to define notions of escape, particularly over the course of the 20th century. But I want to do that by starting with a kind of iconic image of the significance of the city as a site to escape to. This is the original movie poster and then some film stills from Murnau's 1927 silent classic Sunrise, in which the sort of poor farmer who doesn't have a name, none of the characters have names, he's man, his wife is simply wife. And then the other character is this woman with whom he has a torrid affair, who is the woman from the city. And very, in that sense, the kind of the farm where he lives is set up in opposition to the city and the bright lights of the city as this place that is seductively attractive. And eventually he will go there and then will return, et cetera, et cetera. But I just wanted to use this as a kind of critical image for the importance of the city as a place to escape to. And Brent, in some of his notes in framing this, talked about the importance of understanding voluntary escape. And I should note that when I'm talking about kind of gays and lesbians coming to cities, to major urban areas, it is a kind of voluntary escape, removing themselves from kind of conventional locales in order to seek, and I'm glad you brought up Zimmel, because in order to seek out precisely what Zimmel talks about in the Metropolis and Mental Life, that the anonymity of the city, while it can potentially have the effect of creating this sort of blasé attitude that is necessary, it also is potentially liberating because of the way that it allows you to remove yourself from the stultifying environments of a small town where everyone is highly individualized and highly particularized. So what I want to do now is just take us in my 8 remaining slides or whatever I have here, take us on a kind of sweeping tour of principally New York City over the course of the 20th century, attempting to look at the ways in which queer New Yorkers began to map what we could think of as spaces of escape. Most of these are highly invisible. Most of them no longer exist. And they require a certain kind of comprehension. They require their own set of urban codes within the city. So we're looking here at basically the intersection of the Bowery near Grand Street. The Bowery, of course, was an epicenter of slumming and low life at the very beginning of the 20th century. This is from around 1900. It was also one of the first places where gays and lesbians congregated on a regular basis in what were regarded, or what were described as fairy hangouts and lesbian dance halls. But they're all but invisible in this image, and in fact you wouldn't know of them unless you had kind of received inside information. But this was a way of beginning to kind of place themselves in the city. What we're going to see here, kind of going across the 20th century, is a kind of an interest in occupying marginal spaces, and also a kind of tension between commercial space, public space, and derelict space. So what we're looking at here would be occupation of profoundly commercial spaces, but only allowed for people who had kind of certain knowledge. More understood was, and much more public in a way, were the ways in which certain chains of kind of cafeteria chains and automats, Child's restaurants and Horn and Hardt's were kind of very important to what we could describe as the kind of queer geography of the city in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Child's restaurants were all over New York City. You can just see which one of these is going to give me the light? You can just see here's a listing of some of them, and it was called actually the Milk Express, as they went kind of from Lower Manhattan all the way uptown. A number of these became regular hangouts for queer New Yorkers, where their presence was in some ways both tolerated, and in other places it was actually welcomed, because they were known to provide, and these cafeterias tended to be open very late in the evening, and so queer New Yorkers would tend to occupy these spaces sort of later in the day when kind of proper straight people had returned to their houses. And so they were welcomed because literally they brought their dollars with them. And so Childs was one such place, Horn and Hardens was another, and these were literally throughout the city. And so the management of these chain restaurants would tolerate this occupation, but it was also a semi-respectable way of congregating in the city. And this is, of course, at a time when homosexual activity is against the law, when congregating with folks of the same sex in any way that could be construed of as sexual is also against the law. So there's a kind of the idea that the managers of these chains would be tolerating this kind of queer presence is not insignificant. And so the kind of ubiquity of a child allows for a new kind of the creation of a space of tolerance, literally a space of escape within the city. So what we're seeing, what we have to remember, of course, is that as the city itself is a grand center of escape for queer people from all over the country, at the same time it's necessary to construct other spaces of escape within the city itself. So from the commercial to public spaces, almost as soon as these grand Beaux-Arts monuments were constructed, they became sites of cruising. At the beginning of the 20th century, Grant's Tomb and Soldiers and Sailors monuments, two of the best known on Riverside Drive, which itself was a kind of long, sprawling cruising ground. Slightly more proper, particularly for gay women, was Bryant Park, which we see, which we see both in its kind of early iteration and then in a renovation that happened in the 1930s. You can see the difference in the towers that surround the park. But as was typical in kind of urban redesign over the course of the 20th century, the redesign of Bryant Park was not just stylistic, kind of shifting from this more informal, picturesque landscaping to the kind of rigidity of the Beaux-Arts scheme that we have here. It was also meant to increase sight lines and kind of visibility within the park itself, thus in some ways attempting to undermine the availability of Bryant Park as, in fact, a cruising ground. And you know, the idea of those who might define themselves in opposition to the mainstream occupying public spaces in this way, I mean, it's certainly not something that is limited to gays and lesbians. Anyone who defined themselves as peripheral or marginal frequently had to occupy public spaces in this way. In the novels of Henry James and Edith Wharton, you often find these wonderful descriptions of kind of a sort of a destitute character retreating to the public space, but also then being subject to a kind of surveillance and sort of potentially being suspect in terms of their occupation of that space. And these, of course, are just some examples that are perhaps less known. Central Park, of course, another critical landscape within these urban sites of escape. When we think about this geography that I'm attempting to sketch out, one of the things that's important to note is that gays and lesbians begin to congregate and to form enclaves in what were generally regarded as peripheral areas, or areas that were slightly off of the mainstream, places where they would not necessarily be noticed by kind of mainstream culture. Now, Times Square might seem to be the opposite of that, because in the middle decades of the 20th century, it is this epicenter of popular entertainment, but it's precisely because of its intense occupation, because of literally the kind of the bright lights and the existence of cafeterias and theaters and saloons and nightclubs, that in fact they were able to, in essence, kind of walk the streets without necessarily being noticed as figures of any kind of particular difference. And so Times Square remains a kind of critical epicenter as a site of escape throughout much of the middle of the 20th century. It gets its own kind of moment in recognition of its kind of liminality with respect to sexual difference in a film like Midnight Cowboy from 1969, where there's a whole series of images of Joe Buck arriving from Texas with great plans to make a success as a male prostitute, and he kind of sort of moving through the crowds of Times Square. Yeah, okay. So the Times Square as one of these critical sites where invisibility is still an issue, and that's all going to change. The same year that Midnight Cowboy comes out, 1969, the Stonewall riots. The Stonewall Inn had been a restaurant since the 1930s, but it also had an active kind of, let's call it, after-hours existence as a gay bar. It was, in essence, hiding in plain sight until a night in the early summer of 1969, when one of the periodic prison raids is met with sort of rejection. The famous riot ensues that continues over the course of a number of, the whole week, giving birth to the modern gay rights movement. With that, the idea of escape within the city is transformed, and the invisibility or hiding in plain sight of escape that existed prior to 1969 is utterly transformed. So while these peripheral spaces continue to exist until they are gradually renovated out of existence, like the West Side Piers, increasingly what begins to happen is that we find the emergence of gay enclaves. And I'll just end with two final images that are kind of critical of that in terms of this evolution. 1972, we're in San Francisco in the Castro. Twin Peaks, which had existed as a tavern, again, from the 1930s, Twin Peaks comes under new ownership. Two lesbians decide to open up this as a gay bar. It is regarded as the first out gay bar in the country because they remove the paint from the plate glass windows and institute it as a kind of out, in-your-face tavern. Earlier this year, it was made a San Francisco city landmark. And then finally, one last image that sort of shows how far we've come. These are pylons that were installed in the Boys Town section of Lakeview in Chicago. This was part of a program of Mayor Daley's in the late 1990s to create neighborhood identity. We tend to think of these as associated with ethnic enclaves. Escape had been sufficiently codified in this particular neighborhood by the late 90s for Daley to declare that, in fact, this could be an official gay neighborhood, and it was the first thus sort of officially urban recognized neighborhood in the country, and in fact may be one of the only ones that's still kind of officially recognized. And I will leave it there.
Thank you very much.